You left, the other half of you stuck around, so you guys are gluttons for punishment. I like it. But it is better. I think these next talks are a little more relatable, although some of you might not have really lived in an area where the Ice Age was. Anybody ever live in the north where there was evidence of the Ice Age, like Minnesota and Michigan and New York, anything like that? The Finger Lakes are all carved by the glaciers. That's why they all go the same direction. The Great Lakes are carved by the glaciers. That's why they kind of go around a circle, and we'll talk about some of that as we go along. But anyway, while we're stalling, for you, young man, I had our table over there. Everything's for sale except these things. And there's a few pamphlets on the Discovery Center. This is our month, or 3 months at a time. They're 4 times a year devotionals. Some of these are old ones are rehashed by Henry Morris, our founder, but we have some new ones that get in there once in a while. And so you get this for free if you sign up for Acts and Facts. And this is a copy of Acts and Facts here. And this is the way we'll send it to you every other month. I think you get about 8 issues a year because there's a couple of special issues. There's a special children's issue in the fall, I believe, December, every year now. And then there's something else. We'll put out some special issues. So you get 8 of these a year. We used to be 12, but they cost us a lot of money to mail them. And it's a lot of work writing them. So it slows down the research if we're constantly, it's kind of like how much do you want to write and how much research. And so we have to kind of balance all that. So the boss decided we'll just do 8 issues a year, and one of them really doesn't involve the scientists at all. So anyway, these are free. And so take as many as you want. There's a couple of old ones. These are, I think, from last year mostly. But you can get these delivered to your mailbox. Presumably the mailman delivers it. Have you guys all noticed that the mail is a lot worse now since COVID? Yeah, like a lot of my packages, I never show up. Or it's a month to get somewhere. Priority mail to priority box to my wife. And it took over a month to get there. I paid, it's supposed to be there in 3 days, and it sat in Indiana or somewhere for days and days and days. And I finally went in to go get my money back because they always tell you you get insurance on it. Like by the time when I tried to claim it, I called up, and sure enough, about 2 days later they found it. So they didn't want to pay their claim out, but I kind of think that moved them along. It's kind of a shame. Well, anyway, what do you do? So we're going to move along and talk about the Ice Age. This is the natural consequence to the ending of the flood. In some ways, this is part of the flood, except it covered a lot of the earth with ice. But it's because of the flood they really set these conditions up. So we're going to kind of talk about revealing secrets of the Ice Age. So there's 2 worldviews. Sometimes we talk about uniformitarian view, which is the dominant view that's taught by schools, public schools, against some Christian colleges. They say everything continues as it always has. There's no beginning, no end. They usually summarize it with that phrase at the bottom. The present is the key of the past. You guys have heard that before? In about the 19th century, early 19th century, late 18th century, they started developing this idea where they would say, oh, I don't see much erosion today. Like out in their fields, there's slow erosion. And you go to the oceans, there's slow deposition. It's like, oh, that's the way it always has. There's no beginning, no end. But they deliberately chose to try to ignore the Bible. And some of the early writings of these geology people starting to establish the science of geology. They said, we're going to try to push the writings of Moses outside of science. So they had a purpose to kind of throw the Bible out, especially the account of creation and the flood. So they said everything we see just goes on slow. There's no catastrophic events. Although Mount St. Helens kind of showed them there are catastrophic events. And so they now think there's occasional catastrophes, but no global catastrophe. God's word is truth, says the other thing. God wrote in the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20:11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. That's why we have a 6-day, work week. You're supposed to rest the 7th day. And there's no reason for a 7-day week. There's no astronomical reason. There's nothing, that we're spinning around the sun. There's the year, of course, going around the sun, and there's the moon cycles, but there's no astronomical reason for the week other than the way God established that is 6 days of work and 1 day of rest, like God did. So he knew that we would need some rest, but a lot of us don't take a rest even on a Sunday like we probably should. Unfortunately, but there's these big competing, views. Is God's word true, or is the word of man true? So the uniformitarian story when it comes to the ice age doesn't really work at all, although it's out there all the time. And if they say it enough, of course, people start to believe it. They go with this idea of a Milankovitch theory, it's called. And this was back in 1997, back when they used to have U.S. News and World Report. They still publish that? Probably not. Most magazines went out of business, or they went online altogether. But back in 1997, they said that secular science has great difficulty explaining an ice age. And that's still true today. I mean, nothing's changed in 25, 30 years. It hasn't really changed at all. Here's the basic idea that they put forth in all these classrooms. There's supposed to be changes to the Earth's wobble. That wobbles a little bit differently. That's the precession kind of thing going on every 26,000 years or so. And the ecliptic, the plane, the record player, basically we go around the sun in, kind of wobbles up and down a little bit. And then there's the tilt of the Earth, all these different things where we're closer to the Earth, to the sun or not. All these things really don't really add up to much, but yet that's all they have. So they think when these cycles all line up, of course, you get an ice age. As you're tilted away further and you're further from the sun and all these sorts of things, and it's supposed to work. So you should have ice ages every a couple million years, but we don't even see any evidence of that in the rock record of any ice ages, except they try to claim there's about 5 earlier ones, but they're spread over hundreds of millions of years. So if this is the mechanism, why don't we see them more often? I think it's a failed mechanism, that these really don't work at all, that you have to, it's a different pattern whatsoever. So what really caused the ice age? We're going to look at that today. And as I told you earlier, it's really the flood. But how do we know there was an ice age? Living in Arkansas, you're probably like, they say there was an ice age, but I don't see any evidence for it. So we're going to look at some evidence from the Great White North, where I grew up in Michigan. Took some pictures recently going back to visit. And you'll see there's lots of evidence for the ice age. But nobody knew there was an ice age until about the latter part of the 19th century. And finally, some European geologists were studying the rocks over there, and they're going, this is really weird. These rocks are way out of place. You've got rocks of granite, and everything below us is limestone. So what's the deal? And so they started realizing there's scratches in rocks and things. We'll see. All this indicated that there was an ice age. So let's look at that. And then the third and final reason, which I think is the most important, is the biblical reason. Why was there an ice age? And I kind of alluded to that too. Everything God does is a reason. I mean, we can see it in hindsight, but we don't see it all along. So let's look at how do we know there was an ice age. And so we're going to look at, here's the kind of the maximum extent of the ice at the end of the ice, or during the ice age. You see all that white covered much of North America, all the way down to the Great Lakes regions and New York. The actual Long Island is actually a glacial moraine. We'll talk about moraines here in a minute. And so it came down and carved the Finger Lakes. It carved 4 of the Great Lakes. 4 of the Great Lakes were carved by the ice. And it covers Greenland still today. It still covers Antarctica today. But there's very little snow in those areas. It's so cold. But building up that snow and ice happened very quickly, we think, and covered a lot of northern Europe and covered much of like northern Siberia in that area as well. So we find these frozen mammoths, and you find these frozen, cats and things like that in some of these areas still, but they're not that old. But there really was an ice age, but it didn't affect Arkansas, right? So you don't care. It's like it didn't affect Texas. They don't care. But yet they had mammoths walking around Texas, the Waco mammoth site. They had mammoths and mastodons in Florida. So all these weird ice age animals were roaming around here. Well, where'd those animals come from? They had to come from the ark and walked across to get over here. Or you wouldn't have animals at all like that. So let's talk about that. Here's the Great Lakes where I'm from. The 4 of the Great Lakes other than Lake Superior, which is this one. Because I know Texans don't know the Great Lakes. It's okay. That one way up there is Lake Superior. But this one is Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, where I lived. I grew up right about here, and which is part of the lake, see. Originally, we'll see there was water there. That's why it's as flat as Arkansas. Right here. But most of Michigan's got a lot of hills, except that area. And there's Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And they all follow the rocks, soft rocks full of salt and gypsum. So if you're a softer rock, you're going to get scoured more by the ice, and that's why they got scoured more. And they left these big depressions a couple hundred feet deep that filled in with groundwater, just like digging a pond. And so they big natural lakes really are just big ponds that were covered by the glaciers. So they came down And there's different names to these. You can see the patterns in the rocks. And the water, there's two different lake levels. There's this Lake Algonquin level. This is, again, I grew up under the water here. And that's why it's so flat. But the rest of it's kind of hilly. But the water level is really high, and there was still ice in Canada at the time, they think. And then the ice melted back and allowed outlets to go. And the water was able to escape. Just the ice melted back. And most of the lakes drained away. So the period when the lakes dropped really low. Just think today if that happened. They'd be like, we're all going to die. But it happened in the past. They actually figured out, and it went right, zipping right through here and made this big gorge just a couple hundred feet deep. The Mackinac River Gorge between this lake and that lake. So those are pre-lakes. This is Lake Michigan today, Lake Huron over there. But the water just zipped through and carved a big canyon. And so because of that, they had to build a bridge to span that canyon called the Mackinac Bridge. Anybody drove over the Mackinac Bridge ever? Pretty good bridge, isn't it? It's about 5 miles long almost, 4.5 miles. It's the longest suspension bridge in the Western Hemisphere. It's bigger than the San Francisco one because they had to span that big channel. So underneath here, the reason they couldn't build a causeway is between here and here, you have a big channel that goes down a couple hundred feet. So it zipped through as the water drained from one lake to the next. Then the water came back up, filled it back up so you have water. This is the next lake level. This is the Nipissing level more recently. And so this is probably like 3,000 years ago or so. And some of it's draining off this way, and eventually it all started draining out that way because the land rebounded. Once the ice left, the land actually rose because the weight of all that mile thick of ice caused the land to be depressed. And so there's now this, what they call glacial rebound. So the land is tilted back up, and now we have fairly stable lakes. They go up and down a foot or two, over the course of several years, and sometimes they're low, and you have more beach. Then they come up high, there's no beach, but every year they kind of fluctuate a bit, depending on how much rain you get. But nonetheless, if you go up to Michigan's biggest tourist trap, Mackinac Island, have you been to Mackinac Island? Biggest tourist. We hope to have an ICR event up there maybe next fall. Not this fall, but next fall. You go to the island, it's near the Mackinac Bridge, and you can see these cliffs. Those are the two different lake levels. You can see the cliffs. There's about 50-foot cliffs on some of these, and so the Grand Hotel is built on a cliff. This is all dry today. The water level dropped, and so it's pretty stable. And this was the upper level. They call it the ancient island. So all that was during that upper level, that higher lake level, that's all that was exposed, was that little tip of the island. Everything else is underwater. So let's look. Here's the Grand Hotel that they ever see. I've never had the money to stay there, but I've gotten close to it. You can't even go on the property without paying money. And so this is as close as I could get. But my wife stayed there back before she knew me. And it's kind of like the inn downtown. It's very historic. The inn at Piggott, where I'm staying. So I think it's really cool. I like historic things. But nonetheless, from the lake levels, you go up and down a little bit. You can see here's a cliff out to the side. This is what the cliff looks like. And it does drop off. There's a whole upper level there, and you drop off that cliff as you go down. It's supposed to show up. It's supposed to be an L shape. I'm too far away. There you go. There's that first cliff. Then you go higher up. And then you go down to the lower peninsula. You can see these big dunes called the Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes on the lower peninsula of Michigan that rose, again, because of the glacial rebound. So now you have a 400-foot slope there that goes all the way down to the lake because the land rose enough to push those sand dunes all the way up. So this is the angle of repose for sand. Anybody been to Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes? I had to buy one of their shirts to get in this picture. I wrote an article about that, but it goes, if you ever walk down there, don't. Because it's so hard to come back up. And it's like, it takes you hours to come back up. 10 minutes to go down, it's 400 feet of sand. Every step you take, you're just going back down and going back down. It's just, this is brutal. So they tell people don't go down there. Because they've had to rescue a few people, and they have to charge them thousands of dollars to rescue them. Don't try that at home. But you can. And there's also these other lakes in this lower peninsula of Michigan that are all kind of oriented the same direction as the glaciers moved. You can tell the direction of movement because they scoured, like the Finger Lakes, all kind of run north-south. And over here is one of my favorite lakes. That little last one over there is called Torch Lake. It's one of the cleanest lakes in, the whole North America in terms of its water clarity, because it's all sandy on the bottom. So it's some really cool lakes to go visit. That warm up, actually. You can swim in them in the summer, about July. June, still a little cold, but July and August, you can swim in them. There's also other landforms up there in that same area called drumlins, these big lumps of debris that got buried in these big, long, almost looks like whales under the water. And you can see here's a profile view of them. But you see all these drumlins, they all show the same direction of glacial flow. Scientists aren't sure how these form even today. They form under the ice somehow, and they build these big mounds that are all parallel. They're about a half mile long and, 200 feet high at the most, 100 feet high. But we see them all over. New York, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. Anywhere that was glaciated has these drumlins. And we see rocks out of place, like these erratics, they call them. So there's a big piece of granite sitting on top of a bunch of limestone. The rocks in that area are all limestone. There's a huge erratic. I think this is from Calgary, up in Canada, eh? So I can speak Canadian. Canadian, eh? I say that a lot in Ontario. But this was a big, huge rock that was carried in the ice, and just the ice melted, they just drops. And that's where these rocks all came from. So a lot of our fields in Michigan, we had to go around and collect all these rocks to get them out of the fields so they could plow without hitting rocks all the time. You don't have that problem down here. There's big piles on the corner edges of every field in Michigan, piles of rocks. They had to get out of the field, and they keep coming up. The glaciers built lots and lots of rocks, and so there's all these pieces of granite they got to put off to the side in the corner. So all the fields have all these really cool rocks for geologists like me to go poke around in. It's kind of fun. Then you go to places like you can see gouges. Just the bottom of the ice was carrying a lot of rocks as well, and it caused big scratches in the rocks, and you can see scratches there in Minnesota. So you can see the direction of movement. So then you can look at all these moraines. See, these are all the hills that left behind as the glaciers stopped and melted for a while, dumping debris, dumping debris, dumping debris. They're just sitting there melting. Because glaciers don't move back, they melt back, and they leave everything behind. And so they're kind of like General Patton. They're always advancing. They never retreat. They just melt away. And so they leave all these moraines. These are all the hills that we can ski at in Michigan. So you look up here near Mansalona, and you can see these hills. You can see they cut the trees down so they could ski. So those are our big mountains in Michigan. They're like 200 feet high, 300 feet. That's why most people in Michigan, like me, we cross-country ski. Downhilling costs a lot of money. And it's, you're done. You're done. But cross-country is bigger, I think. But people don't want to put the effort in. But I think it's nice because it's quiet. Our state fossil in Michigan is a mastodon. A little smaller than the mammoth, but there's lots of mastodons in the lower peninsula that were living there during the Ice Age. Some of these have human artifacts along with them, stone tools and scratches and cut marks where they were butchering these and eating them as well. So humans were there too. With these elephant animals there, but there were humans along with them. So where did they all come from? They must have come, from the Ark to get over there eventually. So let's look at what caused the Ice Age here. If it wasn't Milankovitch theory, all these wobbles and precessions and everything kind of coinciding, what really caused it? You need to have an ice age, you got to have a lot of snow that doesn't melt from year to year. So if your snow didn't melt here, and next year you just put more on top of it, more on top and more on top, and just kept coming down, that doesn't melt. That's what you need, because if enough snow packs down, becomes ice. So you need cooler summers and heavier snowfall. And we get cooler summers from the volcanoes, as we'll see. So we get our aerosols, all fine particulates that go up into the atmosphere, and they block out sunlight. And so in mountains like Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted in 1991, you had really cold years here in 1992, and 93 even, for about 2 years. One volcano can cool the earth considerably for a couple years. You might not have noticed in Arkansas, but in Michigan that year, we had like 35 below temperatures, those are Minnesota temperatures. Michigan, the lakes do help warm the air masses, so it's not usually that cold. Usually get down 5 or 10 below at the coldest, but it was 35 below that year. I was just back up there for graduate school, and I had no garage. I'm like, well, this kind of stinks. Wrong time for a good volcano in the Philippines to erupt and cool me in Michigan, but that's what it does. It cools the whole earth, especially in the north. The farthest north or the farthest south you go, it's going to have the biggest effect. So you block out sunlight with these aerosols, So you need a lot of volcanoes to erupt to cool the atmosphere, and then you have a lot of snow coming down. It doesn't melt from year to year. That helps keep it going. So Mount St. Helens, when it erupted, we think, oh, that was a big eruption. They didn't cause any cooling. It was too small. Didn't do much. But other volcanoes did. Tambora, that went off in 1815. In Europe, they noticed that was the year without a summer. They never warmed up that summer. It was always like spring or fall, temperatures in the 50s. It's like, is it going to hit 70? Never did. These are from Indonesia. All the way affected all the world. Krakatoa blew up, completely disappeared as an island, dropped global temperatures. Pinatubo was the last one in the Philippines. There hasn't really been a big eruption to cool the earth since, but these things happen, and they make a big effect. I think one of those eruptions actually is when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein because she was stuck inside. They said, well, we got to do something. They started making up stories, and she wrote it down and became the Frankenstein story. So geology caused Frankenstein's story to be actually developed. We actually saved the whales too, just as a sidebar, because we started finding oil. Whereas people were killing the whales for the whale blubber because it burned without a smoke. So the sperm whale blubber, oil was great. You get the oil stuff and it didn't make smoke. And they said, well, kerosene does the same sort of thing. And so kerosene's from the oil, from the marine algae and plankton buried in the flood. They didn't know that at the time, but that's, by finding oil, we saved the whales. So you should be patting your favorite geologist on the back and say, thank you for saving the whales. Nobody talks about this except geologists, apparently. Well, anyway, during the flood, we saw this before. This is from a few continents. This is maybe a little out of date. But the red is the volcanoes. So you can look at all the different rock types as it goes through the progression and peaks here in the Zuni. But look where the volcanic activity starts to show up and where it peaks, towards the end of the flood. That's when you get those subduction zone volcanoes, where you're pushing stuff back in the earth. It makes volcanoes like the Cascades, or where you have subduction zones going on, there's stuff going down. A lot of it doesn't melt, but some of it does. And what does melt makes these very explosive magmas. See, Hawaii is not explosive. Everybody rushes to Hawaii to watch it erupt. But nobody ran to Mount St. Helens to watch it erupt. They ran away. Same sort of thing at Pompeii. When that went off, Mount Vesuvius went off. People should have all left. They had a few days before it got really bad, but a lot of them stuck it out and they died in the volcano. Those pyrocaustic flows and stuff coming at you about hurricane speeds, 1,000-degree particles flying at you, 1,000 degrees Celsius, like molten glass coming at you, and the gases. As people kind of curled up and died, that's all they had time to do. It's very, very quick. Unfortunately, they could have left. So volcanoes don't just blow up overnight. We generally know something's going on. Whereas earthquakes, we still don't understand. They're still a mystery. But nonetheless, the point here is this was by design. This is when the plates really started moving, making a new ocean crust, and you're subducting material away. You're starting to make these explosive volcanoes. You need a completely different chemistry. And so if you guys know anything about distillation, distilling alcohol, doing organic chemistry, you distill things to separate the alcohol from the water. Same thing is true here. You put that back in the earth, even though it's basalt, a black rock going down, up comes granite, because you're only distilling, you're only melting the lowest melting point minerals, which make a granite. So you're just stripping off about 10% of the rock. The rest of it keeps going down. But again, it's all part of the plan. So you make a completely different chemistry, volcanic eruption at Mount St. Helens versus Hawaii. And it all peaked at the end of the flood. So these are some of the big eruptions during the flood. When the flood was receding, there's blue ones and the green ones. These are all when the floodwaters were going down in the Tejas mega sequence. Here's Mount St. Helens, just a little poof, the size of these. So they say if Yellowstone erupts again today, it's going to kill half the country. But fortunately, Yellowstone was a flood event. And I don't believe it's going to erupt like it did in the past. But we see the evidence for it. Major eruptions that were pushing all these aerosols in the atmosphere, helping to cool the Earth's atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds of years after the flood, because they just kept going off and off and off. Unlike today, it was just one here, and then a couple years later, another one over here. They were all going off. All the Aleutian Islands, the Caribbean Islands, the Cascades, they all were erupting at the same time within half a year of the flood or more. Now they're hardly erupting at all. So here's an actual picture of Yellowstone erupting. It's not a real picture, just a made-up one. Beginning of a supervolcano eruption. If you see this, you won't last long. But I don't believe it's going to happen. This was the flood. Most of the eruptions at Yellowstone that spread thousands of feet of volcanic debris for hundreds of miles in all directions. It was a flood event. And so today, you still have magma there, you still have the geysers, but it's not actively erupting and probably won't. But you may get a little poof, but it won't be like it was. So don't worry about that. Residual volcanism could have diminished, as like I was saying, after the flood. This is kind of a cartoon to show it. We don't have really a time frame on here. But the flood ends 4,500 years ago, and then for the next 1,000 or so, 1,500 years, you've got volcanoes that are finally starting to slow down, and there's less and less and less of them. And eventually today, we just get one here and there that erupts about 1 or 2 a year. Maybe you'll hear about them, but they don't all erupt at once. So the spikes, though, of course, would keep replenishing those aerosols in the atmosphere, keeping the atmosphere cold. So cooler summers for many years keeps the snow from melting. But where do you get the hot water from? Where do you get the water? You got to heat the ocean. We talked about this in our first talk on the flood. Enormous amounts of energy needed to heat the ocean. The ocean is 2.3 miles deep on the average. So as soon as you walk on the beach in Florida into the ocean, it averages 2.3 miles deep. So where you're standing, it's very shallow. There's other areas that are 3 miles deep. So the average is 2.3 miles of water for 70% of the Earth. And yet scientists say the Earth couldn't have flooded. There's not enough water. But if you flatten the Earth out and put all the water out, it'd be 8,000 feet deep. And the Earth didn't have as big of mountains back then, so you didn't have to go that high. So today that's true, because Mount Everest is 26,000 feet above sea level. You wouldn't flood the whole Earth, but those mountains didn't exist at the time. And the scientists that argue that, they know better. They just say it anyway, because it sounds, well, it's impossible. There's a new book out by Hugh Ross talking about that. I'm like, oh. So I have a book review of his book coming out, hopefully maybe at ICR, where he points out some of the most egregious mistakes that he says, because he's not a geologist. But you need a lot of energy, and that's where the water was heated by this whole new ocean floor. So the ocean floor was like a conveyor belt. The ocean floor came and went. Continents were really along for the ride. So the new ocean crust was forming and destroying the old ocean crust at the subduction zones, but those subduction zones are making these explosive volcanoes. So they're making aerosols, and the ocean's getting hot because the 60 miles of new ocean crust, this is the ages of them, they're very young here, and they separate in both directions. All this new crust caused the ocean water to get really, really hot. So it might have been 80 degrees from top to bottom. And that's shown here in Celsius, just to make it more confusing, because everybody loves a good Celsius thermometer. But this is stuff modeled by Larry Vardaman, who used to be a ICR scientist, and Mike Ord and other people who was a meteorologist. So he puts it at 20 degrees, which would have been about, maybe 68, 70 degrees. But the whole ocean water from top to bottom. Whereas today it's closer to zero. It's closer to 32 degrees. I'm thinking Celsius again. It's closer to freezing all the way up to top to bottom in many places. It just gets warm at the surface. So the colder water is more dense, so it stays down deep. The ocean is kind of stratified as well. But look how many years it took for the oceans to cool based on some computer models back in the old days, 2,000 years after the flood. So that gets you through a lot of people like Joseph, Abraham, Moses, a lot of people. We're still being affected by the ice age going on, probably a lot more rain going on. That's why that verse I talked about, which I forget which one, in Genesis 15 or thereabouts, talks about, and Egypt was well watered at the time. There were no deserts, probably for at least close to 2,000 years after the flood. And then, of course, the Middle East, the promised land was land flowing with milk and honey. You wouldn't say that today. They irrigate today, but it was doing it naturally, a lot of rain coming out from the hot water. So the oceans were, in fact, here's some kind of further evidence the oceans were warmer. There's articles like this that come out once in a while, Terminal Pleistocene Epoch, human footprints from the Pacific coast in Canada, eh? So here we are north of Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada. British Columbia is here. Vancouver Island, this little Calvert Island, They actually found some Ice Age footprints of humans, and they were barefoot. This is a picture of them. They kind of enhanced it a little bit. So why are they walking around barefoot during the Ice Age if it was cold? Well, the ocean water was keeping the coastal areas very warm. So if you stayed along the 50 miles near the ocean, you're going to get a different climate than you were 100 miles inland. So the big ice was building up further in, whereas along the coast, because the water was so warm, you had a little microclimate. So you could walk along the coast, and it was balmy. It was like Arkansas. But further inland, it was like Michigan in the wintertime. Completely different within probably just 100 miles or so because of the water. So here they are. We see this in Spain and other places as well. Ice Age footprints of humans are almost always barefoot. And it's just odd. They're places where they shouldn't be, that far north particularly. But they didn't need shoes. So we do know there was an Ice Age. We can see the landforms and the carvings and the scratches and the erosion and deposition of them, of these different features. And we have a pretty good handle on what caused the Ice Age. It was the flood, the hot water caused by the new ocean seafloor, causing more evaporation. And then you cool the earth, especially in the north, with all these volcanoes going off, cooling the atmosphere with the aerosols. So as long as those were going, you had a much cooler earth. So the snow would build up and build up and build up, and over time that snow becomes ice. That's how we get ice in Iceland today. That's how we get ice in Iceland. Greenland, Iceland too as well, but in Greenland and in Antarctica. But 97.5% of the world's water is in the oceans. There's about 2% in those ice caps today, Greenland and Antarctica. And it's fresh water, because fresh water is what, rain comes down fresh. But there's not much water left for us to drink. There's a lot of groundwater. In terms of the world's water, like I said, 70% of the earth covered with water, 2.3 miles deep on the average. Yet they don't want to believe the earth flooded with water. But yet scientists will tell you with a straight face that Mars flooded. And there's not a drop of liquid water on Mars today. But they say it flooded. You guys heard that? They keep saying Mars flooded. I don't know if it did or not. But I can believe the earth a lot easier since we're still covered mostly with liquid water. So what's the biblical reason? Because most of you fell asleep now. Because you had a snack, and then it's a kind of a boring talk. And it's like, I thought this was going to be better. It is. It gets a little better. This is interesting now. This is for the pastors out there. There's at least one in here, right? At least one, maybe some others. Now you can argue about the dates, if you want to believe the Septuagint or the Masoretic text and all this stuff. But we'll go with this. The flood is about 2349 BC, thereabouts. And the Abraham was maybe 1996 BC, around 2000 BC. Is that about right still? People say that. Job might have been about the same age. Job and Abraham might have lived at about the same time. But that was probably during the Ice Age. But there was no ice covering the Middle East, just like there was no ice covering Arkansas. It was further north, in Europe, further north. So the ice was in Siberia in places, but there was still an Ice Age going on. So it's a much cooler climate and a much wetter climate for probably 1,500 years or 2,000 years. So if you read the book of Job, again, this is your assignment for tomorrow. There's a break after church till I speak at 5:30, is it? 5? There's a break. You can read the book of Job in between. You can read about some dinosaurs too in chapters 40 and 41, which are pretty cool. We'll talk about those. Job probably lived about the time of Abraham. And in the Bible, if you read through, there's more references to snow and ice in the book of Job than any other book of the Bible. This is written probably around, Job probably lived about the same time as Abraham, and there probably was an Ice Age going on. And you can go to our Discovery Center. We have a whole show on that, and they quote some of the verses from the Bible and talk about the ice and the snow and lots of references to it, because it was probably snowing even in the Middle East. Just wasn't building up ice. A lot more rain. So this is what really happened. This is, climate change. People should pay attention because it already happened. When the Ice Age ended, it warmed up considerably because the glaciers melted because you stopped putting up big volcanoes. The volcano system shuts down, the atmosphere warms up. And sure enough, that's what it's doing. And they're blaming it on you. But here's one where they did 30 degrees, which is about 80 degree temperatures, coming down. And again, it took In this case, they think the average ocean temperature might have taken only about 700 years. I think it's longer. But this is a secular curve showing the sea level rise, they say, in the last 20,000 years. We would compress that to just a few thousand years. But this is what you see. This is in meters. So you're looking at 120 meters of sea level rise in a very short amount of time. Not caused by any human industries, not caused by burning of coal, burning of oil. And you multiply that times 3, you get 360. Almost 400 feet in real life of sea level rise. Even if you believe in deep time in the last 20,000 years, if you believe that, which I don't, you'd have 400 foot of sea level rise. Why weren't people out there with signs protesting? Do you think the Neanderthal people were protesting? What did they do? They moved to Arkansas. The only people that still won't move are the people living in New Orleans. They need to move. They're below sea level. It's not a good thing to be, especially when you have hurricanes. But look at the sea level rise. Even the evolutionists believe this. This is real. The years aren't. But it just went down. That went up. The ice melted. Sea level rose very, very quickly. The ice ended probably about 700 years after the flood. This is after the flood. The ice, a lot of it probably started to melt about there. The ice age was over, and sea level rose. Well, what was the point of all that? This is the maximum sea level, which we modified. We had to take the evolutionary sea level areas and modify it because the oceans were warm. So notice right along the coast, we don't have any ice. On the coast between Alaska and coming over to Siberia, you could walk along the coast and not be walking through ice because it was still warm by the water. But this is the maximum, glacial maximum. Look at all that land that's there. You could almost walk to Australia. You could walk right across Alaska to Siberia. You could walk from France all the way over here to Ireland. That's all dry land. So animals were able to repopulate the earth at the end of the flood, even though everybody got off Mount Ararat, or that area, the mountains of Ararat. I don't know if it was really Mount Ararat or somewhere nearby, but if you land here, somewhere in Turkey or Armenia, wherever it was, and Henry Morris, the founder of ICR, figured out this is about the center of the land masses of the earth. God knew where he was going to land the ark. But you have to be able to walk to all these places within the next few hundred years. So the ice age came on, lowered sea level, made all these temporary land bridges just for maybe 500, 700 years at the most. And then the ice melted back, water came up, isolated everybody. So we couldn't get as much trouble as we are getting into now with instant communication and the internet and cell phones. I remember losing my mother-in-law one time at a mall because we had no way to get a hold of her. We said, meet you in front of Macy's. And there was 2 levels to Macy's. We didn't tell her which level. So for hours she waited at one level. We're at the other level going, where is she? And we realized, let's look at the other level. And there she was. She was mad. Don't make your mother-in-law mad. It's one of those things that's just something you should remember. If you ever get married or you are married, try not to make your mother-in-law mad. That's not a good thing. Anyway, the Tower of Babel, what happened there? They were going to stick around one spot. They weren't going to spread out and use the land bridges that God was designing into the post-flood design to get to different continents and spread out. God said to fill the earth. And humans were not filling the earth. Animals were, but humans were not. So they got in trouble again. God had to confound the languages. He goes, let us, speaking with the Trinity, let us confound the languages so they would spread out. Because if you can't talk to somebody, pretty soon you're going, I'm leaving. And then they started leaving. And then over the course of a couple hundred years, they actually found these land bridges just for right there, like stepping over, like, oh, look at this, it's dry land. And this is the evolutionary route of human migration. The years are totally wrong. But I couldn't have drawn this better. Look where everything starts. Right about where you think it would. Maybe just a little further north where the ark was. But everything comes from there. And you could walk anywhere during the Ice Age. You could walk any of these locations. There's a little bit of water to get to Australia, but not much from one island to the next. You could see the next island. You just couldn't actually walk there. And that's why I think some of these unique animals got over to, like kangaroos swam a little bit and got over to Australia, and they were killed everywhere else. They had to come from the ark, so there's pictures of kangaroos in India, cave drawings, but there's no kangaroos in Asia. But they had to come across Asia to get to Australia. But the lions and tigers and bears killed them all. There's no lions and tigers and bears in Australia because they didn't go across that little bit of water. A lot of other animals did. So it's almost like God preserved some of these animals by getting them over here that would have been wiped out everywhere else. It's kind of like God provided a little zoo for us. Koala bears, cute little furry things. But anyway, I couldn't have drawn this better. It's just the years are wrong. It's like, there you are. God provided the land bridges, but those land bridges are going to be temporary until sea level rose that 400 feet, boom, and isolated them off. Here's what you could do. You could walk across Siberia to North America, which is what people did. And even the evolutionists believe this. They just have the years wrong. Yeah, they believe it was dry. They could walk across there during the Ice Age too. They just try to say it was 20,000 years ago, that sort of thing. But here's Europe during the Ice Age. You can walk right across. They call this Doggerland. Most of the North Sea is very shallow. Sea level drops almost 400 feet. That's all dry. So it's a good thing Hitler wasn't around then. He just drove right across. You know, God's timing is perfect. He knows when things are going to happen. He isolated England for a reason. He isolated Ireland. All these places got isolated for a reason. And there's even evidence out in the North Sea. They actually found a sand ridge called Brown Bank where they found submerged human settlements during the Ice Age. People were living out here because it was dry land. Just like Louisiana. When the water came up, they moved to Arkansas. They moved over here or there, they had to pick. And the water came up probably very quickly, probably within a few decades of time. The water is coming up really fast, but people are not as dumb as we make them out to be. They move. God knew they would move, but they probably were annoyed. They had their houses there, but they still see these stone structures where the people are living under the water today. And what are the extreme climate change people telling you? Well, sea level's going to rise 60 feet. It already went 400. It already warmed up. So climate change already happened. They missed it. They feel bad, so they're trying to make something out of nothing. But it has been warming since the Ice Age. It's just a lot of it happened already. So in summary, revealing the secrets of the Ice Age, there was a scientific reason, scientific evidence that tells us there was an Ice Age. We can find all these landforms and scratched rocks and rocks out of place, the erratics they call them, things that shouldn't be there. Moraines. If you drive north, you'll see them. Lake levels on like Mackinac Island, places like that, you can see them. And the Ice Age was caused by the flood. The conditions of the flood set it up. They made the water warm by making a new seafloor, and in the process, destroying the old seafloor created these explosive volcanoes that were erupting. Once that all stopped moving, the volcanoes pretty much stopped. The plates stopped. The water cooled off for the next 1,500 years. Stopped raining so much. Stopped producing, and you started developing deserts. And Egypt became a desert. The Sahara became a desert. During the Ice Age, there were lakes out in the Sahara. There are rivers flowing through the Sahara. Even the evolutionists believe this. They just have the years wrong. So there is a lot of evidence that there was major climate change took place. But that climate change was necessary to allow animals and humans to fill the earth at God's command. And we weren't doing it right away. We were staying at the Tower of Babel. So God had to confound the languages. So when you read your Bible and you're talking about going out to the desert, you should hopefully have a version that says the wilderness. Because when the Israelites were running around, they escaped from Egypt, they were not out in the desert. Probably even then, it probably wasn't a desert. It was the wilderness. That means they were away from cities. So it wasn't as dry as it is today. They weren't living in sand everywhere. They might not have had enough water. Occasionally Moses had to allow God to strike it with his rod to make water come out for them to drink because they had a lot of people. But it wasn't a desert like we see today. Egypt was in a desert. It was well watered for a long time after the flood, but eventually it did stop, and it became a desert. And finally, the ice age was necessary for the dispersal of not only animals, but humans, to get us in all the world. Then the water came back up and isolated, the Native Americans that got here from the Europeans, and vice versa. So the water came back up. And that was God's plan as well, to keep us from getting into trouble too soon. If we were to stay at the Tower of Babel, he knew we'd be getting into trouble too soon, so he had to spread us out. And they were going to miss that window of opportunity when they could walk across from Asia to North America. It might have taken hundreds of years, but the ice was still thick enough to suck up water like a sponge. So the ice sucked up the water like a sponge, and so its sea level dropped. And when it melted, it came back up. I probably neglected to tell you that. So the thick ice sheets are about a mile thick. They covered northern North America, northern Europe, northern Asia. There's a little bit of ice in the mountains as well. Most of the mountains were heavily glaciated with alpine glaciers. You can see evidence of that in Grand Teton National Park and everywhere else in the Rockies. And then even the Andes, high elevations, got more ice. There's a lot less ice on them today. So people are getting, the glaciers in Glacier National Park are melting back. Well, they've been doing that since the Ice Age. Today they're still doing it a little bit, but a lot of it already happened. But they forget during the Little Ice Age, because there's been fluctuations in 500-year fluctuations. There was a Little Ice Age where the glaciers were growing from 1350 AD and about 1850 AD. That's when the glaciers are coming down on these villages in Europe and almost took out some villages. They were starting to worry about that. But nobody protested. Because they couldn't blame it on humans. When I was in school, the 60s and 70s, we were going to an ice age, we're all going to die. Because it was getting colder in those 50 years, just after World War II. And it started to warm again. But, Al Gore starts all of his curves after 1850. For 500 years, it was getting colder. And, of course, for 500 years, it's probably going to get warmer, which is what those cycles have done since the time of Jesus was on the earth. Yes, but there's the medieval warming period, and there's the cooling period. And so Greenland and Iceland was much warmer during the medieval warming period. The ice melted back. But they don't tell you about this stuff, because they want you to think it's all caused by you, and so you should be paying more money to your government, because they know what to do with it, right? They put it in their pockets. And they all get rich at our expense. But it's just a kind of a scam, and so it's sad. So the Ice Age really was necessary, and it was part of the flood, the ending of the flood, a natural ending to the flood to allow animal and human dispersal just by walking. Eventually we took boats, of course. But, hard for elephants to walk on, take a boat. They have to float. And so if they could walk, to get the mastodons and the mammoths over here, they had to walk across that, Siberia. Across Alaska. God had a plan all along. Isaiah 55:9 says, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So when I do this study and this research, collecting rock data and looking at these types of things, it just amazes me how, you see the wisdom of the Lord, but yet we're only seeing this much of it, because he's so much, infinite knowledge, and we're just struggling along like a little ant down there working on some stuff. And we really don't see it. But we do see a little bit. He gives us some wisdom. When you pray for wisdom, you do get some. But neither is there salvation in any other. There is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Again, here we are in Acts talking about Jesus. There's only one way to heaven. And that's through Jesus. But God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were still yet sinners, and we're still sinners. But if you've accepted Jesus, you're a forgiven sinner. But while we were still sinners, while we were still basically, ignoring him, Christ died for us 2,000 years ago. Much more than being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. So there'll be another judgment. The flood was a judgment of the wickedness of humanity. And unfortunately, it caused the death of a lot of animals as well. God preserved 2 of every kind, at least, on the ark. But many of those animals, like the dinosaurs, went extinct between the flood and today. We'll talk about those a little bit more tomorrow. But And it's amazing how the creator of the universe, who created everything, can judge the earth with a flood, was willing to step into as a human, be born, of a virgin, grow up, minister for about 3 years, change the world, die on the cross, though ultimately he had to die as that perfect sacrifice for all of us. And we're now justified by his blood. He took our place. He took our jail time, our sentence. So when we get to heaven, those of us that accepted Christ, he'll be like, what sins? Yeah, he'll welcome you into heaven. All because of what he did. And there's a book out there by my colleague, Jake Hebert, that goes into the Ice Age and climate change in a little more detail than my book does. There's a chapter in my Carbon Stone book on the Ice Age, but he goes into more detail. And there's chapters on the Ice Age in this book as well. So we've got a little bit of everything. And again, if you haven't signed up for your free Acts and Facts coming, some of you already get it. You get this as well, a little devotional, which they pick a verse and do a little devotional every day. We read these at ICR pretty much every day when we do our morning chapel. We pray, and so if you have prayer requests, send them into ICR. We'll pray for you as a team. But these are free, so sign up for this. That's our gift to you for, again, suffering through these talks. And so hopefully you got something out of this one. If nothing else, God had a plan. The flood was ending. He had to have a plan to get the animals back. And maybe you never thought of that, to get humans back. And that was the Ice Age, by lowering sea level 400 feet, actually lower than it is today. It allowed these land bridges to be there, but only temporarily. And then the water came back up and isolated everything. So it was a good thing, or we probably would have already gone through Armageddon by now. Because humans are pretty wicked and pretty evil, and to get them all together, it's even worse. And so I think that's even God's plan to move the plates around and separate the continents, whereas it was one, pretty much big continental mass. All these things you think about, like, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Because you see the wickedness and the evil today with all the instant communication we have. And how people just hate Jesus, they hate Christianity, and we're seeing more and more of that every day. And so if nothing else, if you have, no money to support ICR, your prayers are more important than that. So pray for us as we kind of go through this, because we have a lot of people that hate us. We need protection from someone coming by with a gun or something. You never know what's going to happen in this day and age. And so God's protected us so far and blessed ICR, so we must be doing something right. But we're sinners too, so we don't always get it right, but we do our best. So thank you all very much, and we'll have one more talk on the fossils coming up at what time? 5 o'clock? Yeah, see, this wasn't as bad. I think it was more fun. This is my wife's favorite talk. She likes the Ice Age one because it kind of ties the Bible and makes some sense out of things. So anyway,